When I was 6, 7, and 8 years old working with Bruce Pandolfini, the work we did mostly was in the endgame, and that was part of Bruce's genius as a teacher. He helped to instill in me a love for chess, but also he taught me how to play the endgame. And this is the most important part of the game for children to learn, because, you know, you guys, when you're playing chess games, you might be in a complicated middle game, but usually the game will simplify to an endgame, and you have to be confident in your ability to win those games. You also have to know the basic principles of converting an advantage in the endgame when you're up a little bit of material. So, in this game, I was playing a great guy named Jacques Elbilia. He's a good friend of mine, actually, and the game was played in Bermuda in 1998, in the last round. I had the white pieces, and in this position I began with a tactic, and I later converted into an endgame and won. And we'll look at this game pretty quickly. I want you to notice how the game begins with a tactical shot, a 1-2 punch, and then it moves into an endgame, where I convert because of my powerful 2 bishops. So first of all, in this position, we're beginning, I'm down a pawn, but he has weak pawns. His c4 pawn is a big weakness, and I can take advantage of it. What would you play with white here? Okay, so I began with a tactical shot, knight f6 check. It's a strange looking move, because it's hanging in a lot of different ways, but it's very powerful. White is much better already. So clearly if he moves his king, his rook on e8 is hanging. That's bad for him. He's got to take it one way or another. If he takes with the knight, I simply take back, and now I'm going to win a piece. His queen is attacked, and his bishop is attacked. That's fantastic for white. Also notice if he were to play e5 to throw that move in, I could take it with the knight, because suddenly my bishop on g2 is jumping into the game. His knight on c6 is pinned to his rook on e8. All of black's pieces are hanging. I'm winning. If he takes with the bishop, I would simply take back. Again, e5 is no good because his knight on c6 will be pinned to the rook I could take with the knight. So he has to move his queen, after which I'll just take on g7. And I have a fantastic position. His pawns are very weak, and this is actually similar to what happened in the game. So my opponent played g takes f6, I played e takes f6, and now he moved his queen. So the idea of my tactic wasn't so much to win right away, to mate him, but to get a dominant endgame position. Here I began by taking his bishop, f takes e7. His king is weak, and you might want to try to attack it, but there's no way right away, and I should have no problem with going to an endgame when it's great for me. And now he traded queens. Queen takes d1. Now I have to make a decision. I can take with my rook on a1 or my rook on e1. I decided to play rook e takes d1 because I wanted to use my other rook to attack his c-pawn. And now Jacques played knight takes e7. So let's take a minute and look at the position. First of all, temporarily he's up a pawn, but that doesn't mean anything, because I could, if I want to, play bishop takes h6 right away. Plus his c4 pawn is so weak I can win that one, and his c5 pawn will be weak after that. But the most important part of the game are my 2 bishops, and development. Notice how the 2 bishops are so dominant. Compare his 2 knights to my 2 bishops. They cut into his queen side. My knight can move anywhere it wants with discovered attack. I have total control of the d-file, and he has very bad development. And also, notice the pawn islands. When I worked with Bruce, he taught me about pawn islands, and pawn structure can very easily be evaluated in the endgame with this method. All of my pawns are connected. I have 2 pawn islands. 1, 2. My opponent, on the other hand, is 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. His pawns are much weaker than mine, and I can pick them off at will. They can't protect one another. So I began with knight e5, discovered attack. He blocked with knight d5. And here I took his pawn, bishop takes h6. So now temporarily it's even material, but he has a lot more weaknesses. The c4 pawn is attacked. I can take that one whenever I want to also. He played knight h to f6, and now I took on c4, knight takes c4. So if he takes on h5, his knight on d5 will cause him problems. I could take it twice if I want to win a pawn right away. Bishop takes d5, e takes d5, rook takes d5. So instead he played bishop b7. I improved with rook ac1, and now he took my pawn. And here I want to talk about the basic principle of converting an endgame. When you're ahead in material, or with a combination you can gain material, you want to trade off pieces. Let me describe to you why. Say that you're with a friend, and you both have 5 pieces of cake. That's even. But what would happen if you were with a friend and your friend had 6 pieces of cake and you had 5 pieces of cake? Would that be a problem? You might notice, okay, yeah, my friend has one more piece of cake than I do. But, you know, you both have a lot of cake, 5 pieces to 6 pieces. Who really cares? You're both going to be full. You can't eat all that. Now, let's say if someone took away a piece of cake from each of you. One of you had 5 pieces, the other had 4. Okay, no big deal. You still have lots of cake. Let's say somebody took 2 more pieces of cake away from each of you. So now your friend has 3 pieces of cake, and you have 2 pieces of cake. Now that's a much bigger difference. You're starting to feel uneasy about the situation. Maybe this isn't fair. He's got more cake than I do. Now what happens if somebody takes away 2 more pieces of cake from both of you? Suddenly your friend has a piece of cake and you don't have any cake. You're hungry, you want some cake, and your friend has all the cake and he's not going to give it to you. That's not what you want to happen. So in this way, when you had 6 pieces of cake to 5 pieces of cake, it was no big deal. But then when your friend had the last piece of cake and there was nothing for you, it was a big problem. That's what the idea of converting the endgame's all about. If you look at it in terms of pawns, in this position, we both have 4 pawns. But soon I'm going to win a pawn and I'm going to have 4 to 3. I want to keep on reducing the material as much as possible. Now, try to figure out a way in this position to start to trade down and to win material at the same time. What do you think I did? Here I began a simplifying combination. First I played knight d6, forking his rook and bishop. He has to defend with rook b8. Next I took the bishop, knight takes b7. He played rook takes b7. Now do you see what my idea is? I'm going to win a pawn, but also I'm going to start simplifying already, converting the endgame as we go into it. I played rook takes d5. Your first instinct might have been to take with the bishop, but that doesn't simplify. I played rook takes d5. He has to take back. And now I played bishop takes d5. So now his rooks are skewered to one another. He has to defend them. He played rook a b8. Notice, of course, that if rook takes b2, I would take his rook for free and be up a piece. And after rook a b8, I took the rook, bishop takes b7, rook takes b7, and now I continued munching on things. I played rook takes c5, and now look what happened. Through this combination that exchanged everything, I'm up 2 pawns, and there's very little material on the board. Plus, notice, I have a bishop and rook, and he has a rook and knight. This is a big advantage for me. In the endgame, a rook and bishop work together much better than a rook and knight. It's a good rule to remember. After rook c5, he played knight back to f6. And here I decided not to take the pawn, because he could take my b2 pawn, and I wanted to do the best I can. I played b3. Now I'm threatening to take that pawn and have 2 queenside passers, so he played a4, gave one up. He didn't want to get passive with rook a7, because I'll win the pawn anyway. After a4, I took it. He played rook b2, attacking my pawn. I moved it out of the way, a3. He played rook a2. Now he's trying to get behind my passed pawn, but I'm not going to let him. How would you play with white here? The key rule is passed pawns must be pushed. I want to push my a pawn up the board and make a queen, but first of all, let's defend the a3 pawn so we can't stop it. I play bishop c1. The bishop is defended by my rook, so it's under no danger, and now my plan is clear. The a pawn's going to go straight up the board. He played knight e4. I played rook c8 check. He played king h7, and now I calculated that his knight and rook were no danger to my king, and I just started pushing my pawn. a5. Knight takes f2, a6, knight h3 check. I played king f1, and now Jacques resigned. There's nothing he can do to stop my pawn from coming up the board. a7, a8. I'll make a queen, and he's going to lose the game. His knight and rook can't do anything against my king in this position, so I'm winning. So it's very important when you're up material to simplify into the endgame a lot of the time, because that's the best way to win a lot of positions. You have to be confident in your ability to play the endgame. So if there's ever a question whether you should study the opening or the endgame, study the endgame. Because when you're memorizing opening positions, you're not learning anything about chess, you're just memorizing. But if you learn how to use the rook on an empty board, and the bishop on an empty board, and the knight, then you'll be able to use them in the middle game and the opening much more effectively. Take my word on it. The endgame is the part of chess you should study most. Let me just show you one more thing about this position. Just a little trick with the rook and knight against the king. If his rook was on d2, and his knight were on f3, and it were black to move, this position is a forced draw. Do you see why? It's a very interesting trick, and you should remember this relationship between rook and knight. My king can get stuck here. He plays knight h2 check. If I go to e1, he just goes knight f3 check. I can't take his rook because the knight defends it. I have to go back to f1, then he can check me again. I have to go to g1, then he can check me again. And now, king f1 is forced, because if I go to h1, rook h2 is checkmate. What a huge mistake that would be. So I have to go back to f1, then h2 check, and it's perpetual check. Just remember this. The knight and rook can force a draw on an empty board against the king, even if white is doing lots of things on the queen side if I'm about to make a queen. Remember this idea. This is pretty much the only way that the knight and rook can act together without anybody else's help against the king. In this game, of course, I was aware of it, and I didn't allow my opponent to get this kind of counterplay.